Okay, here's your information for Chapter 13. This is one of our most involved chapters in terms of the amount of material. It's also an important chapter because it gives you some tools to be able to understand what's going on in our economy and hopefully be able to use that to your advantage in terms of knowing what's going on in the economy, knowing when things are going well and things are not going well, and being able to adjust your personal financial situation or your business financial situation to whatever's going on in the economy. All right, you need to know for the quiz on page 336, you need to look at the graph there. It talks about some of the things that go into figuring gross domestic product, including depreciation and income of different types. And the graph there will give you a guide as to what goes into that calculation. On page 337, it talks about gross domestic product. It talks about value, which is in dollars. It also talks about not double counting. Remember that the gross domestic product measures final goods, does not measure parts or parts of goods in its total calculation. The different categories, there are 4 categories on page 338 that go into gross domestic product. The graph at the top of the page, make sure you look at that. On page 339, you'll need to be aware of the elements of national income, the things that go into national income. On page 342, the definitions of inflation and deflation are there. Make sure that you know the difference between those two. Inflation is a rise in the general price level, and deflation is a drop in the general price level. Page 343, Consumer Price Index, is a measure of inflation. Be aware of some of the things that go into that measurement, some of the comparisons, the base year, the market baskets. These are all things that you should look at in your preparation for this quiz. Page 348, there is an aggregate demand graph there, and also an explanation of aggregate demand. Make sure you understand the difference between aggregate demand and regular demand. Aggregate demand is everything demanded by an economy or by a group. And regular demand is one product or one market. Same thing on page 349 with aggregate supply. And be aware of aggregate supply, the aggregate supply curve, and the difference between aggregate supply and regular supply. Okay, on page 350, it shows you the equilibrium price level where those two cross. Page 352, the business cycle diagram. You should be aware of the 4 stages of the business cycle. You should also be aware of some of the things that can move us from one phase of the business cycle to another. For example, you can go from prosperity to a downturn in the economy because of an event like a natural disaster. That would be an example of a way that movement can be caused in the business cycle. Then the last thing in the chapter that you need to be aware of is economic indicators on page 358. There are a number of different types of economic indicators that give you an idea of what's going on in the economy. There are leading, lagging, and coincident indicators. You should know what those mean. Be able to identify at least one of each from that chart on page 358. And then you should be aware of the questions I told you about in class from the end of the chapter on page 362. Those questions will appear on the semester or on the quiz for chapter 13 and on the unit test. Maybe not in the same form, but they will appear in one form or another.